Lipstadt determined not to apologise to Irving and to prove in court the truth of what she had written. They had retained one of the top libel advocates, Richard Rampton, QC.
I was first notified that I would be needed for the case about 2 years before it began by Anthony Julius, who I've known for a very long time. Then about a year before it started, I was sent a whole bunch of papers, including about 3 feet of experts' reports. I then took 9 months doing nothing else but prepare for the trial, which included learning a basic method of reading Nazi German, because I had to make sure that I was up to speed, because I knew that Mr. Irving knew the documents, as well as having very good German, which I didn't have. So it was a lot of hard work. Preparation is the key to all litigation.
Well, you learnt
Yes, that
German.
was part of my 9 months' homework. Learnt enough to be able to read it, yes, with help.
And had you known any German before?
None at all, apart from a few bits of the magic flute and that kind of thing.
Compared to the lawyers lined up against him, Irving was determined to represent himself in court as a so-called litigant in person. But he had a wide range of far right-wing sympathisers across the world with whom he kept in constant contact through email and the internet. They could help him prepare for the case and produce documents for him.
As a historian fighting a libel action, you're confronted with 2 alternatives. You can have the case fought by a historian who's a bad lawyer or by a lawyer who's a bad historian. And I chose the former. Well, of course, you know the old saying that somebody who acts for himself has a fool for a client. I was well aware of that. The obvious advantage is, of course, the defendants in this action have spent £6 million defending themselves. It would have cost me something of that order of magnitude to bring the action.
£6 million, you're
yes,
saying?
Or $6 million.
Well, there's a difference.
Or £2 million, or whatever the total was. There is effectively no difference. I would have had to spend certainly £500,000 if I had used counsel. I don't have that kind of support financially. I have a broad base of support around the world of 2,000 or 3,000 people who will write out checks varying from $5 to $5,000. But I couldn't have gone to them and said, I now need £500,000.
How much do you get from your supporters around the world, your broad base of
Over the
support?
last 2 years, it's raised £250,000.
Who are these people?
Ordinary people. There were no mirror images of Steven Spielberg there, who put up most of the money for Deborah Lipstadt.
That's total fiction. I don't know Mr. Spielberg. I've never met him, but he did make a contribution. But I think there are a whole lot of extra zeros there in terms of his contribution.
The defence lawyers decided on a twin-pronged strategy to counter David Irving. They'd commissioned 5 experts on Hitler and the Nazis to try and find evidence that Irving was a falsifier of history. The second prong of the attack was the so-called discovery process, the system which enables each side in a libel trial to get the other to provide it with documents and material that may be relevant to the case. Both Anthony Julius and David Irving were to make full use of the discovery process. Julius used it to gain access to David Irving's extensive private archives.
I did that because it seemed to me to be clear that Irving's books were merely a small aspect of his output, and that one might get a better and clearer sense of the trajectory of his career by reading his private diaries, by reading his speeches, watching his audio tapes and so on. We had a hearing. Irving resisted the application for disclosure. In the end, the master, the judge who heard it, decided in our favour, and we obtained a mass of documentation. I mean, it's a general rule in litigation that whether you find yourself a defendant or a claimant, you run the case as if you were a claimant. So it was the right thing to do to go on the attack. And that's how the Irving work became the central focus of the trial. We were oversupplied with weapons and material, and it was a walk in the park, really.
Anthony Julius was coordinating his pre-trial strategy with Richard Rampton, the QC who would represent Penguin and Deborah Lipstadt in the libel court.
Mr. Irving writes, I think, very well. I've read all his history books, if you can call them that. It's a racy kind of narrative style. It's sometimes like reading a good thriller. The trouble is with it, so far as Hitler and the Jews is concerned, they are a trap for the unwary, because they're simply not true. It always seemed to me that Irving's great weakness was the extent to which he had, and it must have been deliberate, distorted, skewed, mistranslated and misrepresented the historical sources.
Under the rules of discovery, which are the best part of an English High Court action, In theory, you can oblige your opponent to come clean with everything in his or her files. And I played the white man, if I can put it like that, without being dismissed as a racist yet again. And I gave my opponents complete access to all my files. I said, take the lot and satisfy yourself what there is in there.
You'll find that we had to spend quite a long time in court in a pretrial hearing getting those diaries. He fought us tooth and nail on giving up those diaries. So, you know, another rewrite of history, perhaps?
Through the process of discovery, we got, first and most importantly, a large chunk of his personal diaries, ordered by the court, which were, from our point of view, and eventually from the point of view of the court, a goldmine. Because what they showed was, first, that he was an enthusiastic participator in events organized by neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists. But second, which did surprise us, perhaps a little more, was that, according to what he had written, he was profoundly anti-Semitic, which does rather suggest a motive for his adulation of Hitler.
At last, 3 years after Irving had written his first threatening letter to Penguin, and 2 years after he'd issued his libel writ, the case came to court. It was billed as the trial of the century, and unlike a normal libel trial, which is heard by a jury, both sides had agreed in pre-trial hearings that the case would be heard by a judge alone, sitting without a jury. But even on this matter, where there was agreement between the two sides, as with so much of the case, there's a dispute between them as to exactly how it happened. First, Anthony Julius's version.
In one of the early pre-trial hearings in front of the master, when the question of mode of trial came up, whether it would be by judge alone or with a jury, I said to the master that we thought that, on balance, it would be better if the case was tried by a judge alone because of its complexity, and Irving, I think, charmed by the thought that he was involved in a case of complexity, immediately said, yes, I agree.
I proposed that there should be a judge alone, and the defendants accepted it readily, much to our surprise. We thought the defendants would ask for a trial by jury.
Why did you agree not to have a jury in the trial?
It's swings and roundabouts. The immediate disadvantage which did occur was one which I must admit I was not aware of. That if you have just a judge trying a case, there's a danger that at the end of the case the judge will say what he thinks about you. This is purely my own ignorance. I hadn't realized that the judge would have an opportunity to say all the things that he thought in his judgment. The advantage of having just a judge was that it would shorten the case because you wouldn't have to explain everything over and over again to members of the jury. The judge is considered to be somewhat brighter than the jury.
Also, it's considered to be.
Considered to be. The disadvantage of having a jury, in my view, would be that the defendants would have filled the witness box with Holocaust survivors, in quotation marks, wearing their pyjama suits, plucking at the heartstrings of the jury. And I would have been made personally responsible for every baby had been tossed into the flames. And that's the way they would have played it. It wouldn't have been very helpful to the course of history.
Since it was Irving's own awful books that became the subject of inquiry at the trial, calling witnesses of fact to events in the Holocaust was a completely unnecessary exercise. What's more, the last thing that I or anyone else in the defence team would have wanted would have been to subjected people in their 70s and 80s to the invasive and bullying questions of a hectoring anti-Semite.
Richard Rampton had agreed that the case would be heard by a judge alone, sitting without a jury.
It would have been more uncertain for two reasons. First, because of the factual complexity of the issues. It involved issues of translation and an understanding of history, the precise historical background of documents. But also because with 12 people in a jury, you never know how many of them might sympathize with Irving's political ideology. You can't tell, and in England we can't question them about that. So there would have been a greater element of uncertainty, there's no question.
The judge chosen to hear the case was Sir Charles Grey. Formerly himself one of the leading libel silks, he'd been a judge for 10 years, but had only sat in the High Court since 1998.